ELITIST Datto is gone! Just kidding, love you Datto. And by that reference, you can imagine what this video is about. I'm here to tell you why raid difficulty is diminishing, why accessibility is different from difficulty, to make sure the casuals are getting gatekept from interacting with the endgame, to make sure the 1% of PvE players are content, to make sure the endgame thrives, to make sure I replace ELITIST Datto and become the new elitist around town. Ha! None of that was true, except for how accessibility and difficulty are two different subjects in the day one. But if the Homelander music isn't indicative that that was a joke, then I'm sorry for your loss. Let me go ahead and by emphasizing, I'm not an elitist in any way. I want to note, Bungie devs are people and don't deserve harassment or death threats in any way. However, this community is a little bit critical of any dialogue, good or bad. For example, if I say the raid dev team makes bad game design choices, I'm questioning their approach to design and not them as people. Bungie devs are people, just don't harass them, be good, kind people. I wanted to segment the video in different parts, talking about the raid in general, accessibility, mechanics, difficulty, master mode, and the middle ground compromise. And that last one is just my own suggestion, since most people in Destiny makes opinions but don't suggest anything. So if Bungie goes with any of my suggestions, I want credit for my idea. 50k Bright Dust, Final Shape Collector's Edition, and I want to help design mechanics for the upcoming raid. Of course, I'm kidding, none of that would happen, but isn't it at least cool to think that I could get credit? Guys gotta shoot a shot. Rooted Nightmares is the brand new raid and central topic around difficulty right now in Destiny. The content mode features 48 hours instead of the usual 24 hours to complete the day 1 race. To the active day 1 raiders, this piece of content is considered the pinnacle difficulty of Destiny, the hardest piece, and the proving ground for Destiny difficulty. If you want to showcase your expertise and skill, Contest Mode Emblem is a piece you obtain to prove it. World's first completion has been decreasing over the years, the longest being Last Wish at almost 24 hours, Vow being the last at 6 hours, and this year at roughly 2 hours and 30 minutes to completion. This is what started the conversation around difficulty, the pinnacle raid content being absolutely steamrolled in record time. People take work off, move their schedules, at the very least wait a whole year to get a new, fun, hard raid. And the raid was just destroyed in record time. My fire team completed the day 1 race, mostly just trying to complete it the day 1 raid, but we were also completing an LFG team with hardly any low man experience. The only 2 encounters that were okay were the first and third. All first raid encounters introduced the mechanics that will be used in the raid, and this mechanic was pretty weak in many ways. It was easy, simple, and doesn't involve throughout the raid much. The mechanic is quite literally telegraphed to you. You don't need to know much about the mechanic since the mechanic literally tells you what to do and is quite obvious. The best comparison is the wire mechanic from the Spire of the Watcher. The mechanic is literally just connect the dots. In fact, this image here is the perfect representation of what the raid mechanic is. The problem with this raid is that there's less to do, less people have to interact with the raid, and more people have to add clear, which is already 99% of the rest of the raid. Or sorry, the game. I don't want to go deeper into the raid mechanics just now, because it's a separate category. But just know for now that the mechanics were more so dungeon-like instead of being raid-like. I understand people didn't want another symbol raid. I also didn't want another symbol raid. But that doesn't mean I wanted a dungeon-like mechanic into this once-a-year raid. Especially when the mechanic is similar from the dungeon that released 3 months ago. Our day 1 team with very little experience and not the most optimal DPS loadouts had very little struggle. We took a lot of breaks, a lot of loadout switches, and mostly had a casual attitude towards the contest mode. If we decided to optimize our team, or at the very least did several practice raids together, we would have easily gotten sub 6 hours. So, when did our team clear contest mode? We cleared it out in 9 hours and 51 minutes. So if all of that's true, then why are people even arguing that this raid isn't easier, and that this contest mode is just as impressive as Vow of Disciple? Just the simple reason that they were 190,000 unique character completions, or even that this raid is the best due to accessibility. Well, for one, accessibility is massive. It's a massive W, and this raid is a complete success when it comes to accessibility. But to be completely honest, it is better than Vow accessibility, but not by a huge margin. So let's talk about accessibility. Accessibility is an interesting concept for day 1 raiding, which is more so 48-hour contest mode. Ever since Beyond Light, we have had a week and a half to prepare for day 1 raids, which give more time to prepare for the light level cap. You can see the significance of this change with Deepstone Crypt had a lot more clears than previously seen for a raid. Frankly, Deepstone Crypt was a shorter raid as well, but it was a bit harder due to the damage checks and simple reason of power creep not yet scaling. So, how did Vow the Disciple improve on accessibility? Vow to Disciple gave the standard week and a half to prepare for the day 1 raid, but also introduced a legendary campaign. Considering that most players have done the legendary campaign, you probably know that the completion rewards give plus 20 light to whatever the soft cap is, therefore meaning you skip 90% of the grind for the day 1 raid. You are essentially raid ready the day the expansion drops and have a week and a half to practice or farm any new god roll rolls. This is a massive for accessibility, but something huge also happened for Vow the Disciple. There were issues with the servers, so they extended the day 1 race by 24 hours. The first time the contest modifier was 48 hours. Yes, while people were completing the raid a little bit later because of the server issues, Vow the Disciple still had more players try and complete the day 1 raid due to the extended timer. This is a massive win for accessibility and getting players to try it without compromising the difficulty of the raid at all. So, how does the Root of Nightmares improve on this? Root of Nightmares introduces the 48 hours to complete the contest modifier permanently, and this without a doubt is a good change. So, what else can they do to make it more accessible? Honestly, nothing else. Raid is already extremely accessible, because you have to remember, accessibility does not mean you have the ability to complete the raid, nor should it. Accessibility is whether or not you have the ability to attempt the raid, to get in the front door, in which case this raid is completely succeeded. There have been very few players argue about the accessibility. Even quote-unquote elitists agree on accessibility in the raid was a great thing. So, just to give more insight to why the raid wasn't very difficult, let's go back and talk about the mechanics and finish the discussion on why the mechanics were a bad thing. Let me recap the main mechanic real quick for those who skipped the beginning. Shoot the ball to get the buff, follow the arrow, shoot the ball to deposit, and that's it. The mechanic tells you what to do. There's very little guessing, besides guessing relatively where arrow shows you to. I also stated this mechanic is just like the Spire of the Mechanic, or Spire of the Watcher Wire mechanic, where you shoot the wire to wire until you complete the circuit, which is almost identical to the raid mechanic, just takes a little longer. The reason why I call this mechanic less raid-like and more dungeon-like is because the mechanic can be done solo and requires virtually no interaction with anyone else. This is a problem, because dungeons, even with a trio, can be virtually be done by one person. This also means 4 to 5 people, at least, are ad clearing at all times, which means 4 people are not interacting with the raid, or just interacting with the same enemies that exist in all parts of the game. If you want to fight Shadow Legion, go complete the terminal overload activity. Just don't make everything else in the game feel like you're just also doing it in the raid. The second encounter evolves a little bit, not by making the mechanic harder or introducing a real new concept, by just replicating the mechanic they already had and just making another one that you also have to worry about. So there's a light and there's a dark side now. That's about it. You have to have ad clearers take the aura 2 with you so they can shoot the immune enemies. Not really that much of an evolution. You have to complete the circuit by 2 minutes or you wipe. Wow! Incredible! Then guess what? You're not gonna believe this one. There's a jump pad mechanic. If you've tried it, then I don't really need to explain. But for those who aren't used to Destiny physics, then just know this mechanic is self-destructive and forced our team opted to use the Eager's Edge to cross the gap instead of using the mechanic. Unfortunately, we've had wipes due to the aura disappearing on the second floor after completing the encounter, and we have been sent too far on the jump pads, causing our timing to be off, potentially wiping us. Other than that, it's basically just the first encounter, complete the circuit on time, and clear all the ads to make it easier. The third encounter was the best encounter by far, since it actually was a raid mechanic that required you to solve a puzzle and figure out what's going on by not having the obvious being stated to you. Unfortunately, this raid also required 4 people on ad clear, or 2 on ad clearing depending if you wanted the mechanic to go faster. Our team did all planets at the same time, which meant that we had 2 people ad clearing at all times, so we did have more people interacting with the mechanic. This also makes the time faster. The concept was a specific enemy to spawn a bigger enemy. So you would have this Centaurian guy, I think, and then he would spawn this other guy, the guy who gives you planet insight, which allows you to see which planets to swap on both sides. And then both players tell each other which planets to swap on their side. So if left side was left planet and right side was right planet, then on the right side they would go grab right side, the planets would start the shift timer, and that player would go to the left and hit the left planet, and then at the end of the timer, the planets would shift. A little bit confusing, but for the sake of the video, it's not really that important to know. Once all 4 planets have been shifted, you do it again. Both the planets in the middle. Definitely the best and most unique mechanic, but at the same time, also still had the same issue with 4 people not interacting with the raid. Or again, this just depends on how many people you had to do the mechanic if you wanted to do it slower or faster. The boss also had a major issue, and that was boss health. The point of acquiring god rolls is that you want better ad clear or better boss damage. This boss honestly just required LMGs, which is not known for their high damage even when you can dump a whole large reserves they have. This is how little HP they had. A better example would be the Vex Incursion Force on Neomuna having more health than this boss. A Patrol Public event had more health than this boss. So yeah, this boss was burned. The most difficult part was doing it 2 or 3 times depending on your damage. There was definitely plenty of error to be made, but if you were on ad clear, your experience is just waiting for teammates to succeed or fail. With current ad clear / power creep, everything in the room gets blown up if you are consistently clearing with decent weapons. The last encounter in Nezarec is the boss and another moving boss. His encounter was much better than Rolk in my opinion. Contrary to what most believe, Rolk moves and tries to attack you, but his attacks are way too predictable, and with today's resistance, Rolk probably wouldn't one-shot you anyways. Fortunately, Nezarec chases you throughout the raid, regardless of the DPS phase triggering. This means that the boss is a lot deadlier than Rolk by far. Also, the mechanic goes by super quick, so precision is important. But guess what? Only 3 people are required to interact with the raid. 3 people can watch YouTube or Netflix while mindlessly shooting ads. My job on during the day 1 was just to get the gaze from Nezarec. I would sit on well and just hope my teammates finished the boss circuit mechanic to start the DPS phase. Now, here's the big shocker my team had after the day 1 race. There's a white preventation mechanic! We didn't even know that! We were getting our timing precise to clear Nezarec. That meant no refuge mechanic. We avoided an entire mechanic because it didn't matter. You can skip it, and honestly, it's much easier. After the contest mode, I've had teammates mess up gripping up with darker light, and I would just recommend learning to complete the mechanic fast as you go into DPS phase. Now guess what? This boss also doesn't have much health. To make a joke of the raid on contest mode, cleared it with wrecking. Your weapons did not matter. You know those weapons you've been farming for the last 3 years? Could not matter. That's it. That's the whole raid. So let's talk practically about how power creep influenced the difficulty of the raid, and whether or not the raid was actually difficult. I remember doing the Deep Stone Crypt raid day 1, but to my recollection, that raid was 100 times harder than the new raid. The mechanics had a lot more puzzles to it and more to do per player. During the day 1 for HX1, that raid from what I remember required almost everyone to do something. Our team was stuck on the encounter for 12 hours. We didn't even finish the raid. But at least every single one of us had some engaging mechanic to complete while also ad clearing. Keep in mind, back in Deep Stone Crypt, we had the Aquilos SMG, and the most ad clearing we can do was with Warmind cells. Recluse and Mountaintop just got sunset, and we had very few meta weapons that were strong. In fact, exotics were the strongest weapons at the moment by far due to sunsetting not affecting exotics. Imagine this. Put the first encounter of Rooted Nightmares in the Deep Stone Crypt power creep era, and every team would struggle, if not be the encounter that single-handedly stops most teams. Most players were only running 100 recovery, no resilience since it was 20% back then, and considered the worst stat. All weapons were weak. Ironically, with that level of difficulty, the first encounter would be hard. Even more ironic, roaming supers would actually be useful for once, since roaming supers would be way powerful than typical ad clear guns, tormentors would be an absolute pain to deal with, and timings would be very short. In fact, since damage wasn't a big deal in this raid, ad clear would be the biggest pain with the old power we used to have. The point I'm trying to make is, this raid was much easier because the mechanics were easier to execute. Less people could mess up back then, and now more people can mess up with very little of consequence. The mechanics are very forgiving. Remember the exhibition encounter? That raid had a bit to ad clear, but that encounter is considered one of the hardest D2 mechanics introduced in the game. And why? The reason is simple. More people have jobs, therefore there's more that can fail. That is on top of what the ad clear that is required, on top of having to read symbols and memorize and then shoot the right symbols. There were about 5 things going on in the exhibition, with 3 unique rooms that changed the strategy. You start on the first floor and go, hey, this isn't so bad. Then, the second you go, okay, this isn't so bad. Then by the third encounter, you're panicking, realizing how difficult this encounter really is. The evolution of that difficulty exists. How did mechanics get harder in Rooted Nightmares? It didn't. Just how dungeons are. The mechanic is introduced, and it doesn't change, which is amazing for a dungeon, but for a raid, it can be seen a bit lazy and definitely easier. No doubt that a DPS check would have also easily stopped most players from completing the raid, but that is also part of the reason why the raid was easier. I think the real question that should be asked is, should raids stay at this difficulty or should they be harder? There's no doubt in my mind this raid was easier. Accessibility shouldn't mean easier raid, it should just mean easier to get into the door. This should stay the same or improve, but the main question is whether or not the raid should be harder. Yes, the raid should be harder. It is a raid after all, but also think about it like this. The contest modifier only adds a cap that makes you underleveled for most encounters. There's no doubt the mechanics were on easy mode, but even Vowed the Disciple gets cleared in about an hour and a half without contest modifier just on a regular. The difficulty of raids comes from memorization. After the day 1 raid, the difficulty itself will be easy since enemies are no longer tanky. Why can't they just make a fun, challenging raid, make it hard for 2 days of contest modifier, and people just learn the mechanics for the rest of the 363 days before the next raid? When you make the raid easier, you just make the raid more of a dungeon than a raid. If you were to make the dungeons much harder and longer, you would also get more of a raid-like dungeon. Oftentimes, I find the community gives opinions, but never give a solution, so real quick, let me explain a solution that I came up with. Raids are separated into 2 parts, the Master Mode and a Normal Mode. My suggestion is to make a very hard raid, keep it part of the Master, and release it in a week after the Normal. What about the casual experience of the Normal Mode? Once the Master Mode is completed, you can remove a lot of the precise timings and even remove mechanics from the Master Mode into the Normal Mode. Even if you remove most of the mechanics, there's probably still more unique mechanics than Root of the Nightmares introduced. There's other related material to potentially cover, such as the game director interview with SkillUp, although I didn't think there's particularly any hard-hitting questions or answers given. The answers were pretty much how Jack Blackburn talked about seasonal content getting stale back in Season of the Seraph. Yeah, we're changing things, taking more risk, but how and when we won't say. This is pretty much what I expected, but I didn't really care about these interviews or answers until they were definitive or at least examples. There was also the raid developer insight, but if I had started including that in this video would have been a little bit more heated. They knew the jump pads were causing an insane amount of deaths. Yeah, they added this wacky mechanic that was breaking instead of just removing it. Why not just give us the caretaker stairs? I know the jokes are Bungie reuses all their assets to the extreme, but honestly, why didn't they try to recreate the wheel on this one? I kind of feel like the reason why physics will bring you to 1 HP instead of just instantly killing you is exactly because of these jump pads. In this interview, he also asked about the raid difficulty, and all he said was, the raid team is still discussing it, and I don't want to speak for them yet. Which seems to me they have no clue if the raid should be harder or easier. If this raid was easier on purpose to allow more players to play it, then why are they discussing it? Shouldn't they know they should keep it easier? It just seems to me they didn't hit the mark with their internal goals, and at the very least aren't sure if they want this raid to set the standard for future raids. Anyways, at the end of the day, all that matters if you enjoyed the game. Most of these designs are made ahead of time. I imagine the Witness raid will probably be much harder to raid than usual. It might be below Last Wish in difficulty, so I imagine we won't know what new standard of difficulty is until the expansion after the final shape. I wanted to also note, I understand it's nice to have a nice and easy raid after a hard one, but come on, it's out once a year. Are you seriously getting exhausted at the most unique content Destiny releases by far? So that's it. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and comment. I stream on Twitch and on this very YouTube page at the same time. I'll be working on a new game series, most likely on some niche game. I enjoy making videos on golden gems in the industry that deserve recognition, so if you could, make sure to put on notifications. Thank you, and cheers.